The steam howls before it breaks, metal creaking under strain, a low groan that rises from the bowels of the steamboat like a warning no one can hear. The Mississippi swollen black and wide beneath a moonless sky, fed by weeks of spring rain, its surface 30 feet higher than normal, its current twice as fast. April 27, 1865, 2 hours past midnight. 7 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, where the river runs deep and cold and unforgiving, the Sultana drifts upstream with impossible weight on its decks. 2,100 souls packed into a vessel built for 376. Bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, men sleeping where they stand, leaning against one another for support, wood groaning beneath their feet. The decks sag visibly, bowing under the load. Ropes hum, taut. Timbers crack. The 4 boilers somewhere below, tubular iron cylinders fed by the filthy, sediment-choked water of the Mississippi, breathe heat and pressure into the dark, each one interconnected, each one straining, each one a bomb, waiting for ignition. Somewhere in the lower deck, between the furnaces and the flooding river, the middle larboard boiler has already been patched. A quick fix, a rivet job, not a replacement, just enough to hold until the payday clears, just enough to get these men home. No one speaks, exhaustion is heavier than iron. These are not tourists gliding toward luxury hotels. These are not wealthy passengers heading to parlors and ballrooms upriver. These are men recently freed from Confederate prison camps, Andersonville in Georgia, where 33,000 Union soldiers were crammed into 26 acres of open ground without shelter, without latrines, without clean water, where 13,000 died from dysentery, scurvy, gangrene, and exposure. Cahaba in Alabama, a converted cotton warehouse where 3,000 bodies occupied space meant for 500, where the Alabama River flooded through the floors, and men stood waist-deep in water for days, clinging to rafters to keep from drowning in their own prison. Released in March under prisoner exchange, they walked to rail lines, then rode freight cars to Vicksburg, then waited in Camp Fisk, a parole camp where they were processed, counted, given rations, and promised transport north. Now they are aboard the Sultana, crammed like cargo, every inch spoken for, every surface covered with human weight. The deck tilts with each bend of the river. Water inside the boilers sloshes violently from side to side, the interconnected chambers creating a hydraulic nightmare. The highest boiler drains when the ship lists. The iron heats dry, exposed to flame. The fires never stop. The metal glows red, then white. Then the ship rocks the other way. Cold river water rushes back over the superheated iron. Steam erupts inside the chamber. Pressure surges past the safety threshold. The rivets strain. The patch flexes. The boiler screams silently into the night. No alarms, no warning, just the sound of breath and the churn of paddle wheels cutting upstream against the spring flood, the rhythmic splash and groan of machinery older than the war itself. 2 months earlier, in January 1863, the Sultana had been launched from the Cincinnati shipyard as one of the most modern sidewheel steamers on the Mississippi, 260 feet of timber hull, reinforced with iron bracing, twin smokestacks rising 40 feet above the deck, elegant railings painted white, a pilot house perched high above the water like a crown, 2 massive paddle wheels 28 feet in diameter. She was built for speed and comfort, designed to carry mail, cotton, livestock, and civilians between St. Louis and New Orleans. She moved with grace, her whistle echoing across the water. Her decks clean and spacious, her cabins fitted with velvet curtains and polished brass. By April 1865, with the war ending and Union prisoners flooding home, steamboat captains saw profit in desperation. The federal government was paying $5 per enlisted man, $10 per officer, to ferry parolees north from Vicksburg, a lucrative contract worth thousands. Captain J. Cass Mason, a 43-year-old steamboat veteran from Ohio, wanted that contract. He wanted it badly enough to ignore the engineer's warning about a cracked boiler, badly enough to accept a patched repair instead of a full replacement, badly enough to load 2,100 men onto a boat designed for 400, badly enough to risk everything for a single payday. On April 21, 1865, the Sultana left New Orleans carrying a light load, civilian passengers, some cargo, livestock, and pens on the lower deck. The journey upriver was routine, but by the time the boat reached Vicksburg on April 23rd, the middle larboard boiler was leaking. Steam escaped in visible wisps, hissing from a crack in one of the iron plates. Nathan Wintringer, the chief engineer, a careful man who had worked steamboats for 20 years, inspected the damage and reported to Captain Mason. The boiler needed a complete replacement, he said. The plates were worn thin. The crack was widening. The repair would take 4 or 5 days, time to pull the entire boiler out, transport a new one from the foundry, install it, test it. 4 or 5 days. Mason refused. Another steamer might take the contract. Another captain might collect the fare. He could not afford to wait. Wintringer called in a local boiler mechanic, R.G. Taylor, who examined the crack and agreed. Full replacement was the only safe option. But Mason pressed. He offered more money. He implied urgency. He made it clear he would not tolerate delay. Finally, Taylor agreed to a compromise. A small iron plate hammered over the crack, riveted into place, reinforced with a brace. Not a rebuild, not a replacement, just a patch. The kind of repair that might last 100 miles in calm water with a light load. Maybe, Wintringer protested. Taylor hesitated. Mason insisted. The patch was applied. The fires were relit. The boilers were pressurized. The Sultana took on passengers. They came in waves, flooding the docks at Vicksburg in the last week of April. Men still gaunt from captivity, clothes loose on bones, faces hollowed by months of hunger and disease. Union soldiers from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Tennessee, Kentucky, men who had survived not only battle but the slow rot of imprisonment, the daily degradation of living in mud and filth, of eating wormy cornmeal and drinking from polluted streams, of watching their comrades die by the dozens each day. Over 800 had been held at Cahaba, crammed into a cotton warehouse where the roof leaked and the floor flooded, and the guards refused to provide blankets or medical care. Fewer than 250 died there, a mercy compared to Andersonville, where 1 in 3 never left. Now they walked to the docks with the single desperate hope of reaching home. They were promised passage, they were promised safety, they were promised that the war was finally over. They boarded the Sultana with relief in their eyes, grateful to be moving, grateful to be alive, grateful for the simple act of going north. But there were too many, far too many. Union Army Captain George Williams, the officer in charge of prisoner transport at Vicksburg, had received orders to ferry the parolees north as quickly as possible. Several steamboats were available. The logical solution was to divide the men among multiple vessels. 500 here, 500 there, spreading the load, ensuring safety. But Williams had other priorities. Rumors circulated that rival officers were taking bribes from steamboat captains to secure transport contracts. Williams feared losing control of the operation. He feared accusations of corruption, so he made a decision. Load every man onto a single boat, all of them, cram them in. Captain Mason agreed eagerly. He would take them all, every last one, $5 per man. Over 2,000 men, $10,000, a fortune. By the time the Sultana left Vicksburg on April 24th, she carried more than 2,400 people, 2,100 Union soldiers, 70 civilians, 22 guards, 85 crew members, a handful of women and children traveling to St. Louis, and several dozen pigs and horses penned on the lower deck. The boat sat low in the water, her hull straining, her guards submerged almost to the waterline. The paddle wheels labored against the current, groaning with each revolution. The decks were packed so tightly that men could not sit. They stood in rows, leaning against one another. Some climbed into the rigging, some sat on the smokestacks, some hung from the railings. The pilot house was surrounded by bodies. The stairs were impassable. Entire sections of the upper deck sagged under the weight, timbers cracking audibly. It took 3 days to crawl from Vicksburg to Memphis, a journey that should have taken less than 1. The Mississippi was at flood stage, swollen from weeks of rain, its surface wide and fast and treacherous, littered with debris, tree trunks, fence posts, sections of buildings torn loose from flooded towns upstream. The current ran at 6 miles per hour. The Sultana moved at 7, 1 mile per hour of forward progress, every mile earned by straining boilers and laboring engines. The boat rocked with each shift in the current. Men crowded to one side to wave at passing vessels. Captain Mason shouted at them to stay in place, terrified that the boat would capsize from the sudden shift in weight. But the greater danger was below. Each time the boat tilted, water inside the interconnected boilers sloshed violently from one chamber to another. The highest boiler drained. The iron plates, no longer covered by water, heated rapidly, exposed directly to the furnace flames. The metal turned red, then orange, then white hot. Then the boat rocked back. Water surged into the superheated chamber, instant steam, explosive pressure. The boilers groaned, the patch flexed, the rivets strained. Over and over, mile after mile, the cycle repeated. At Memphis, the Sultana stopped briefly to take on coal. It was late at night on April 26. The docks were quiet. A photographer named Thomas Wad set up his camera and took a single image, the only photograph ever made of the overcrowded Sultana. In the picture, the decks are black with bodies, men packed so tightly they appear as a single mass, faces indistinct, humanity reduced to density. The photograph survives. It is haunting. By the time it was developed, most of the men in the image were dead. Near midnight, the Sultana left Memphis, pushing upstream into the dark. Men slept where they could, on the deck, against the cabin walls, on top of one another. Some talked quietly, some sang hymns, some stared at the stars, thinking of home, thinking of families they had not seen in years. Most were too tired to do anything but close their eyes and let the vibration of the engine lull them into something like rest. Below in the boiler room, the firemen shoveled coal into the furnaces. The flames roared, the boilers hissed. The pressure climbed steadily, 80 pounds per square inch, 90, 100, 120. The gauge needles trembled. The steam hissed from every seam. The patch on the middle larboard boiler flexed with each surge of pressure, the rivets holding, barely, the iron plate bending inward, then snapping back, then bending again. At approximately 2 a.m. on April 27, 1865, 7 miles north of Memphis, the patch failed. The middle larboard boiler exploded with a sound like the earth splitting. A pressure wave tore upward through the decks at a 45-degree angle, ripping through timber and flesh and iron in a single roaring instant. The blast originated from the top rear of the boilers, punching a hole 25 to 30 feet wide through the hull and into the crowded passenger decks above. Men sleeping there were obliterated, vaporized by superheated steam at 400 degrees, crushed by falling timber, hurled into the air like broken dolls. A split second later, 2 more boilers erupted. The triple explosion shattered the pilot house, killing the pilot instantly. George Caton, his body never recovered. The twin smokestacks, massive iron cylinders weighing over a ton each, collapsed. The starboard stack fell backward into the gaping wound where the boilers had been, crashing through the wreckage, burying men beneath its weight. The port stack toppled forward onto the upper deck, crushing dozens of men beneath its bulk, striking the ship's bell as it fell. The last sound of order before chaos consumed everything. The explosion killed an estimated 400 people instantly, some from the blast itself, some from the steam, some from falling debris. The forward section of the upper deck collapsed onto the middle deck below, trapping hundreds in the wreckage. Some were crushed instantly, others were pinned, unable to move, their legs broken, their bodies wedged between splintered timbers. The sturdy railings around the main stairway prevented the upper deck from collapsing entirely, a small structural mercy that allowed a few dozen men to crawl through the wreckage and down the stairs to the lower levels. But further back, where the decks had buckled into a slope, men slid helplessly toward the exposed furnace boxes. The heat was unbearable. The broken wood caught fire. The remaining superstructure became an inferno. Without a pilot, the Sultana drifted. The explosion had destroyed the controls. The paddle wheels still turned, driven by momentum, but no one steered. The boat spun slowly in the current, a ghost ship already dying. Fire erupted from the shattered boiler room, fed by splintered wood and oil and coal dust and the dry timber of the upper decks. Flames climbed the railings, smoke poured into the night sky, visible for miles. Men woke to heat and screaming. Some thought they were dreaming. Some thought the war had returned. Some lay still, too weak to move, too broken to care. Others scrambled to their feet, panicking, shoving, clawing at one another, desperate to escape. Men screamed. They tore at the railings, ripping off sections of wood to use as flotation devices. They grabbed anything that might float: barrels, doors, pieces of the cabin wall, coiled ropes, sections of decking. They jumped, not in order, not in lines, not with any plan. They leaped through flames into the black water 20 feet below, bodies falling like rain, hitting debris, hitting other swimmers, plunging into the cold and surfacing, gasping or not surfacing at all. The Mississippi in April is brutally cold, 50 degrees, perhaps less. The shock of immersion after the heat of the fire was devastating. Men gasped. Their muscles seized, their lungs locked. They thrashed. They clung to anything: planks, barrels, sections of railing, pieces of the cabin wall, the bodies of men already dead. Whole groups of men locked arms, trying to stay afloat together, dragging one another down. Whole groups sank together, their hands still clasped beneath the black water. Those who remained aboard were faced with an impossible choice: stay and burn, or jump and drown. Some chose the fire, clinging to the bow as long as they could, until the flames singed them off like flies. Others fashioned makeshift rafts from broken timbers, tying pieces together with rope, then cutting loose and drifting into the current, their bodies silhouetted against the flames. A few managed to reach a small island downstream, a narrow strip of sand and trees where the flaming hulk of the Sultana briefly snagged on submerged branches. 20 or 30 men jumped ashore, desperate, half-naked, their skin blistered and raw. They tied ropes to hold the wreck in place, trying to stabilize it long enough for others to escape. Then the ropes burned through. The Sultana drifted free, still burning, still carrying the bodies of those too injured or too weak to move. Men trapped in the wreckage below decks. Men pinned beneath the fallen smokestack. Men who simply gave up and lay down to die. For 20 minutes, the fire consumed what was left of the boat. The wood hissed and crackled. The metal groaned. The decks sagged into the water, hissing as they submerged. Finally, with a sound like a great exhalation, the Sultana gave up. The hull broke apart. The remaining structure sank into the mud on the Arkansas side of the river, a few miles below Memphis. Steam rose in a towering column, visible for 10 miles. Then silence, broken only by the soft splash of the current and the distant cries of men still struggling in the water. The surface of the Mississippi was black with heads. Men bobbed like corks, their faces pale in the darkness, mouths open, gasping for air. Some called for help. Some sang hymns to keep from panicking, their voices thin and wavering. Some imitated the sounds of frogs and birds, anything to distract from the cold, anything to keep their minds from the truth. Bodies floated everywhere, dead men face down, drifting slowly downstream, their clothes billowing. their limbs trailing in the current. Survivors clung to logs, to barrels, to sections of the boat, their fingers white and numb. One man floated nearly 10 miles on the back of a dead mule that had been pinned on the lower deck. Another clung to a wooden door, using it as a raft. Another held onto a piece of railing with 3 other men, all of them too cold to speak, their breath coming in short bursts, their bodies shaking violently. Along the flooded banks, men pulled themselves into the trees, wrapping arms around branches, shivering uncontrollably, too weak to climb higher. Every tree along the Arkansas shore held at least one person. Some held 5. Some held bodies that had already stopped breathing. Men who had made it to safety only to die from exposure, their hearts giving out from the cold and the shock. The water was 30 feet above normal flood stage. The trees stood in the river like sentinels, their lower branches submerged, their trunks slick with mud. Men clung to them for hours, naked, their skin blue, their teeth chattering, waiting for rescue, praying for dawn. Word reached Memphis just after dawn. A teenage boy, one of the civilian passengers, had floated downstream on a piece of wreckage and washed up near the waterfront. He told the sentries what had happened. Within minutes, the city mobilized. Steamboats, flatboats, skiffs, anything that could float was dispatched upriver. The Bostonia No. 2 was the first to arrive, 90 minutes after the explosion, her crew spotting the glow of the fire from miles away. As they approached, they threw bales of hay and planks and anything else that would float to the men struggling in the water. Other boats followed, civilian vessels, military transports, even a few small Confederate craft, manned by former soldiers who had fought against the Union but now pulled Union men from the river without hesitation. One Confederate rower, working alone in a small skiff, rescued 15 men single-handedly, rowing back and forth until his arms gave out. Among the rescuers was John Fogelman, a local Arkansas farmer whose land bordered the river. Fogelman and his sons spotted the burning wreckage as it drifted downstream, carried by the current. The wind blew the fire toward the rear of the boat, leaving the bow relatively clear. 25 soldiers remained on the bow, trapped, unable to jump because the fire had consumed the midsection, cutting off their escape. The Fogelmans did not have a boat. They improvised, lashing together logs to make a crude raft, then paddling out into the current. They reached the wreck as it drifted past, pulling men off the bow one at a time. To save time, they set the soldiers in the treetops along the flooded banks, then paddled back for more. By the time the Sultana finally sank, the Fogelmans had saved over a dozen men, all of them enemy soldiers, all of them strangers. By mid-morning, the river was thick with rescue operations. Men were hauled from the water, naked, burned, shivering, delirious. Many had shed their clothes to swim more easily, stripping down to nothing to reduce drag. Most could barely speak, their voices hoarse from screaming, their throats raw from swallowing river water. They were wrapped in blankets and taken to hospitals in Memphis. The city's medical facilities were overwhelmed. Soldiers were laid out in rows on the floors of churches, warehouses, and private homes. Some had burns over half their bodies, the skin charred black or peeling away in sheets. Some had broken limbs from falling debris, bones jutting through flesh. Some had swallowed so much river water they could not stop coughing, their lungs filled with sediment and bacteria. Nearly 300 died in the days following the rescue, succumbing to burns, exposure, shock, infection, and the cumulative trauma of war, imprisonment, and disaster. They had survived Andersonville. They had survived Cahaba. They did not survive the river. For weeks, a barge left Memphis each morning to collect bodies. It returned each evening with its cargo of the dead. Men fished from the water, men found clinging to trees, men washed up on muddy banks miles downstream. Many were never identified. Their bodies were too burned, too decomposed, too disfigured to recognize. Many were never found. The river kept them, carrying them south, depositing them in eddies and backwaters, burying them in silt. Mass graves were dug in Memphis cemeteries, long trenches where dozens were buried together, their names unknown, their families never notified. Some bodies were sent home, to Ohio, to Indiana, to Michigan, where they were buried under markers that read only, "Died aboard the Sultana, April 27, 1865. The final death toll remains uncertain. Official estimates range from 1,700 to 1,900, though some historians place the number higher. The records are incomplete. The passenger manifest was lost in the explosion. Many of the parolees had not been formally processed. Some were listed under incorrect names. Some were listed twice. Some were not listed at all. The most commonly cited figure, 1,864 dead, makes the Sultana disaster the deadliest maritime catastrophe in United States history, exceeding the Titanic by nearly 300. The investigation began almost immediately. The federal government wanted answers. How had a boat designed for 400 carried more than 2,000? How had a cracked boiler been allowed to operate? Who authorized the overloading? Who accepted the bribe? Captain J. Cass Mason was dead, killed in the explosion, his body never recovered, his testimony lost with him. Nathan Wintringer, the chief engineer, survived and testified that he had recommended a full boiler replacement. His recommendation had been ignored. R.G. Taylor, the boiler mechanic who applied the patch, testified that he had been pressured by Mason to accept a temporary fix. Captain George Williams, the officer in charge of prisoner transport, was accused of corruption, of conspiring with Mason to overload the boat in exchange for a share of the government contract. Rumors circulated that Williams had received a bribe of over $1,000, but Williams was never formally charged. The inquiry dragged on for months. Testimonies conflicted, documents disappeared, witnesses changed their stories. In the end, no conclusive cause was determined. The official report blamed low water levels in the boilers, the rocking motion of the overloaded vessel, and the faulty patch applied in Vicksburg. No one was held criminally responsible. No one was punished. The case was closed. Later investigations would reveal deeper flaws. The boilers themselves were poorly designed, tubular boilers with 24 small flues instead of 2 large ones, making them difficult to clean and prone to sediment buildup. The iron used in construction, charcoal-hammered plate, thin and brittle, weakened with repeated heating and cooling, especially when overheated. The dirty water of the Mississippi deposited thick layers of mud and silt on the boiler surfaces, insulating the iron from the water and causing localized overheating. Over time, the iron became embrittled. Under stress, it cracked. Under pressure, it failed. The patch applied in Vicksburg was never strong enough to withstand the conditions aboard the overloaded Sultana. It was a temporary fix applied to a permanent problem. It held for 3 days. Then it didn't. But the truth, in the end, mattered less than the timing. The Sultana exploded on April 27, 1865, 2 weeks after President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. One day after the final Confederate Army under General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered at Greensboro, North Carolina. The nation was exhausted. 4 years of war had killed more than 620,000 men, more than all other American wars combined. The assassination of Lincoln dominated every newspaper, every conversation, every sermon. The surrender of the last Confederate forces marked the official end of the bloodiest conflict in American history. In that context, the loss of 1,800 men on a steamboat, however horrific, however preventable, was a footnote. The disaster received brief mention in a few newspapers. Most ignored it entirely. The war was over. The president was dead. People wanted to move on. The Sultana was forgotten almost as quickly as it sank, buried beneath the larger tragedies of the age. Of the survivors, a few formed an association. They called it the National Sultana Survivors Association, established in 1889, dedicated to preserving the memory of the disaster and honoring the dead. They met annually for decades, first in large gatherings of over 200, then in smaller groups as age and death thinned their ranks. They shared stories. They wept. They sang the hymns they had sung in the water. In 1933, the last 2 northern survivors met for the final time. Both men in their 90s, both frail, both haunted by the memory of that night. The last survivor of the disaster, Private Charles M. Eldridge of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, died in 1941, 76 years after the explosion. He was 96 years old. By then, the Sultana was a ghost story, a legend, a tragedy known only to a handful of historians and descendants. The wreck itself remained at the bottom of the Mississippi for years, gradually buried by sediment as the river shifted its course. By 1900, the site of the sinking was no longer underwater. The Mississippi had moved eastward, leaving the wreck under 20 feet of silt and soil. Today, it lies beneath a soybean field in northeast Arkansas, unmarked except for a historical plaque placed by the state in 1982 near the town of Marion. Archaeologists have located the remains using ground-penetrating radar, but no excavation has been attempted. The Sultana rests where it fell, buried under farmland, forgotten by all but a few. The disaster did produce some lasting change. In the years following the explosion, steamboat regulations were tightened. Inspections became mandatory. Boiler design improved. The use of tubular boilers was gradually phased out in favor of safer fire tube designs. The Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company, founded in 1866, cited the Sultana disaster as a primary motivation for creating a private inspection service to supplement government oversight. By the 1870s, steamboat explosions, once a weekly occurrence on the Mississippi, had become rare, but by then the names of the Sultana dead had faded, the details blurred. The story slipped into obscurity, overshadowed by the Civil War itself, by Lincoln's assassination, by the grand narratives of reunion and reconstruction. In Memphis, the hospitals slowly emptied. The burned men healed or didn't. The rescued soldiers were put on other boats and sent north. More carefully this time, with limits on passenger loads, with inspections, with precautions. Some reached their families, some died in transit. Some arrived home so changed by battle, by prison, by fire, that they were barely recognizable. Wives did not know their husbands, mothers did not know their sons. The men carried the scars of the Sultana for the rest of their lives, burn scars, physical disabilities, nightmares that never stopped. Many never spoke of it, many could not. The memory was too painful, the guilt too heavy. Why had they survived when so many had not? The river moved on, the war ended, the Sultana became a cautionary tale, a statistic, a tragedy eclipsed by larger tragedies. But for those who were there, who felt the explosion, who swam through the dark water, who clung to trees and watched the fire burn, it was the only thing that mattered. It was the night the river took them. The night the boilers broke, the night they survived the war, only to drown in peace. It was the night they learned that survival is not the same as safety, that coming home is not the same as arriving, that the war never truly ends. It just finds new ways to kill you. Years later, memorials were proposed, a monument in Memphis, a plaque at the site, a national day of remembrance. None were built. A few small markers exist, in Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, where 3 victims are buried, in Vicksburg, where a historical sign mentions the disaster, in Marion, Arkansas, where the state placed a plaque in 1982, but no grand memorial, no national recognition, just scattered graves, fading testimonies, and the silence of the river. In 2015, on the 150th anniversary of the disaster, a small ceremony was held in Marion. Fewer than 50 people attended, historians, descendants, local officials. They stood in a soybean field and read the names of the dead, as many as could be verified. It took over an hour. When they finished, they placed flowers on the ground above the wreck and stood in silence. The wind moved through the soybeans. The river, now a mile away, flowed on, indifferent. The Sultana is gone. The men are gone. The witnesses are gone. The memory fades with each passing generation. But somewhere beneath the Arkansas soil, under soybean fields and quiet farmland, the wreckage remains. Rusted iron, broken wood, the bones of a boat that carried too much and broke under the weight. The fire went out long ago, but the heat never left that river. The cold never left the men who survived it. And the silence, the terrible silence after the explosion, after the screaming stopped, after the last man drowned, that silence remains unbroken in the forgotten corners of American memory.